The morning was quiet, and the street was still half asleep. Shops were just beginning to open, shutters rattling as vendors prepared for another day. She walked with her usual steady steps, carrying a small bag of groceries she had bought for her mother. Life for her was simple. She wasn't rich, but she wasn't bitter either. She had learned to find peace in little things like watching the first light of the sun touch the rooftops or hearing children laugh while going to school. As she turned a corner near the bus stop, her eyes caught something unusual lying on the pavement. It was small and shiny, almost hidden between two cracks of the road. She bent down and picked it up. It was a keychain, silver in color but worn with time. Attached to it was a single key, and on the back of the metal plate were engraved letters, R.M. She looked at it carefully. It wasn't expensive, but something about it felt important, almost personal. People didn't engrave initials on things unless it meant something to them. She thought maybe it was just another lost item, but the way it was kept, smooth edges, polished despite scratches, told her someone must have carried it for years. It wasn't the kind of thing you forget without missing. She stood there for a moment, torn between slipping it into her bag or leaving it where it was. But her nature didn't allow her to ignore it. She had always believed even small things could hold big value for someone. To her, this was not just a piece of metal. It was probably someone's memory, maybe a reminder of a person they loved, or a gift they never wanted to lose. She decided to keep it safe until she found the owner. For the next few minutes, she asked a couple of shopkeepers if anyone had come by looking for a lost keychain. Most of them shook their heads. One fruit seller laughed and said people drop things every day, no one bothers to return them. She smiled politely but disagreed silently in her heart. Later that day, when she was on her way to her part-time job at a bookstore, she kept glancing at the keychain in her pocket. It felt like a responsibility. She wondered who R.M. could be. A student? A businessman? An old man who had carried it for decades? She didn't know, but she hoped somehow she would meet the person. Fate, it seemed, didn't plan to keep her waiting for long. The following morning, while she stood outside a small cafe near the bus stop, she noticed a man searching the ground with an anxious look. He was tall, dressed in a crisp suit, but his movements were restless. He bent down, checked under a bench, and even asked the cafe worker if they had found something. The worker shook his head. The man's shoulders slumped as if he had just lost more than an object. Curiosity pushed her forward. She hesitated at first. What if it wasn't his? But then she remembered the initials. She walked closer and gently asked, "Excuse me, are you looking for something?" The man looked up, and for a moment she was struck by the seriousness in his eyes. They were sharp, like someone used to making decisions every day, but now they carried a softness of worry. "Yes," he said, almost too quickly. "A keychain. Silver, with letters engraved on it. I must have dropped it yesterday." Her hand instinctively reached into her pocket, and she pulled it out. "Is this the one?" His eyes widened instantly, and he reached for it like someone grasping a lifeline. He held it tightly, almost protectively, and let out a deep breath of relief. "Yes," he said, his voice calmer now. "This is mine." For a moment, he just stared at it, his thumb brushing over the initials as though he was touching a memory. She smiled lightly. "I found it near the bus stop yesterday. I thought it might be important." He looked at her then, properly, as though only now realizing the person who had returned something so small yet so valuable. "Important," he repeated softly. "You have no idea." There was a pause between them, filled with unspoken words. She could see his gratitude, though he wasn't the kind of man who easily expressed feelings. Still, his eyes gave him away. "Thank you," he said at last, and the weight of those two words was heavier than she expected. People said thank you all the time, but the way he said it, It sounded like she had just saved something irreplaceable. She waved her hand, trying to make it lighter. It's nothing. Really. Anyone would have done the same. But deep inside she knew not everyone would. Some people would have thrown it away, or worse, kept it without care. For her, it wasn't about getting something in return. It was simply the right thing to do. He seemed to want to say more but stopped himself. Instead, he tucked the keychain safely into his pocket as if it were treasure. Then he straightened his suit, gave her one more look, and said, "If there's anything I can ever do for you, just say it." She shook her head, smiling. "I don't need anything. Just be careful next time." For a second, he looked surprised at her response. Maybe he was used to people asking for favors or taking advantage of small opportunities. But she wasn't that kind of person. She turned away and walked toward the bookstore, not even realizing that her simple act of kindness had just left an unforgettable mark on a man who wasn't just another stranger. What she didn't know, what she couldn't even imagine, was that the man she had just helped was not only a successful CEO but also a father trying to balance a life no one around him truly understood. To her, he was just a stranger with a lost keychain. To him, she was the stranger who had returned a piece of his heart without asking for anything in return. And fate, with its quiet hands, had only just started weaving their story together. The next few days passed like any other. She returned to her daily routine, helping her mother at home, going to her part-time job at the bookstore, and attending evening classes. But sometimes, when she walked past the same cafe where she had met the man, she remembered his expression when he saw the keychain in her hand. It wasn't just relief, it was something deeper, almost like a piece of his soul had been returned. She wondered why such a small object meant so much to him. But she didn't think too long about it. Life had its own struggles for her. Rent, bills, and the never-ending challenge of managing everything with the little she earned were enough to keep her mind busy. She wasn't the kind of person to dwell on strangers, especially men in sharp suits who clearly lived in a world far different from hers. To her, he was just someone she had helped and nothing more. Yet life has a strange way of weaving paths together when least expected. It was 3 days later, on a rainy afternoon, when their paths crossed again. She was rushing down the street with her umbrella, trying to make it to the bookstore on time. The rain had made the city chaotic. Cars honked, people ran for shelter, and the sidewalks were crowded. As she turned near the same cafe, she nearly collided with someone stepping out of a car. She muttered a quick apology, but when she looked up, her breath caught for a moment. It was him. The same man, the owner of the keychain. He was holding an umbrella, dressed in another perfectly tailored suit, but this time he didn't look as tense. In fact, he looked almost amused by the coincidence. "You again," he said, a hint of surprise in his voice. She blinked, then laughed lightly. "Looks like the city isn't as big as we think." He tilted his head slightly, studying her as though he hadn't expected to see her twice. "Maybe not," he agreed. For a moment, they just stood there, the rain falling all around them, their umbrellas shielding them in two small worlds that had accidentally collided again. Just then, a small voice called from behind him. "Papa, wait." She turned her head and saw a little girl step out of the car. She was about 5 or 6 years old, wearing a bright yellow raincoat that made her look like a tiny ray of sunshine in the gray weather. Her curly hair framed her round face, and her eyes, big and curious, sparkled with innocence. The girl ran to him, holding his hand tightly. "Papa, don't walk so fast," she said with a little pout. He immediately softened, his stern look melting into something warmer as he bent slightly to her level. "Sorry, sweetheart," he said gently. Then, noticing the woman still standing there, he introduced the child without hesitation. "This is my daughter." The little girl looked up at the woman and, without a moment's hesitation, smiled. It was the kind of smile children gave only when they felt safe. "Hello," she said cheerfully. The woman couldn't help but smile back. "Hello. You're very polite." The girl giggled, hiding behind her father for a moment before peeking out again. Something about the woman seemed to draw her in, though she couldn't explain why. He looked at the scene quietly, almost surprised at how quickly his daughter warmed up to this stranger. Usually, the little girl was shy around new people, hesitant to talk or even make eye contact. But here she was, smiling freely. The rain continued, and for a moment, it felt like time had slowed. He cleared his throat and said, "We were just about to go inside the cafe. Would you like to join us? It's better than standing in the rain." She hesitated. It wasn't every day that a man who looked like he belonged in boardrooms invited her for coffee. She wasn't sure if it was right to accept, but the little girl tugged at her sleeve with innocent insistence. "Come with us. Please." That simple request made her smile. She nodded softly. "All right. Just for a while." Inside the cafe, the air was warm and filled with the smell of fresh coffee and baked pastries. They found a corner table by the window, and the little girl immediately sat next to her, surprising even her father. "What's your name?" the girl asked curiously. She told her, and the girl repeated it with delight as though she had just learned a new favorite word. For the next few minutes, the conversation flowed easily, though not in the way she expected. Most of it was with the child about school, favorite colors, and stories about pets the girl wished she had. The woman listened patiently, answering each question with genuine interest. Meanwhile, the man watched quietly, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he hadn't touched yet. He couldn't remember the last time his daughter had been this open with someone new. It stirred something in him, a strange mixture of relief and curiosity. Who was this woman who had returned his keychain and now, without effort, was earning his daughter's trust? Eventually, the girl excused herself to look at the display of cakes by the counter. Left alone for a moment, he spoke. "She doesn't usually talk this much to strangers." The woman smiled softly. "Children feel things we can't always explain. Maybe she just feels comfortable." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. After a pause, he added, "The keychain you returned, it belonged to my late wife. She gave it to me years ago. That's why it matters so much." She looked at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. Suddenly, the depth of his reaction that day made sense. It wasn't just about the keychain, it was about holding onto a memory he couldn't replace. "I see," she said gently. "I'm glad I found it, then." For a moment, there was silence, heavy with unspoken stories. He didn't usually share personal things with strangers, but something about her presence made it feel natural. She didn't pity him, and she didn't pry. She simply listened. The little girl came back, holding a small cupcake, and the mood lifted again. They laughed, they talked, and before she realized it, time had passed quickly. When they finally stepped out of the cafe, the rain had stopped. The little girl hugged her unexpectedly, a warm, innocent gesture that took her by surprise. "Bye. Will you come again?" the child asked eagerly. She knelt down, smiling. "Maybe. If our paths cross again." The man watched the exchange, quietly thoughtful. As they parted ways, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time their lives would intersect. And she, walking away, couldn't help but think that something unusual had just happened. What started with a lost keychain had now brought her into the life of a little girl and her father, a man who carried more stories than his serious face revealed. She didn't know what it meant yet. But life, once again, was preparing her for something she could never have imagined. The next week came and went like a blur. She busied herself with her classes, the long hours at the bookstore, and her household chores. But in quiet moments, she found herself remembering the little girl's laughter. The way the child had clung to her sleeve, the innocent smile, and the unexpected hug had stayed in her heart. Children rarely opened up so quickly, and that small act had left an impression she couldn't ignore. Still, she didn't expect to see them again. The city was too big, and people lived in different worlds. She thought their paths had crossed twice by chance and that was the end of it. Yet, deep inside, she felt a small part of her hoping otherwise. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon when fate decided to prove her wrong again. She was at the bookstore, arranging a new stack of novels on the display shelf, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Excuse me, do you have this book in stock?" She turned around and froze for a second. It was him, the man with the serious face and sharp suit. Except today, he wasn't alone. Holding his hand tightly was the same little girl in her colorful dress, her eyes wide with excitement as she looked around at all the books. He gave a small nod, almost like an acknowledgement. "Hello again," he said in his calm voice. "Hello," she replied, slightly surprised. "You're here." "My daughter wanted to come," he said simply, glancing down at the child whose attention was completely taken by the children's section. "She wouldn't stop talking about books. And then she remembered you worked here." The woman blinked, a little touched. She remembered. The girl beamed up at her. "Yes. You said you worked in a bookstore, and I told Papa I want to see you again. I want to read stories with you." Her heart softened. The innocence in those words made her forget the tiredness of her shift. She knelt down to the girl's level. "Well, you came to the right place. Let me show you the best stories." The child's eyes sparkled, and she eagerly followed her through the shelves. Together, they picked out picture books, fairy tales, and even a simple story about animals. The girl sat on the floor, flipping through the pages, while the woman sat beside her, reading aloud in a gentle voice. Her expressions, the way she brought the characters to life, had the little girl giggling and clapping in delight. From a distance, the man stood quietly, watching the scene unfold. Something stirred in him that he hadn't felt in a long time. He had seen many people try to interact with his daughter, relatives, teachers, even caretakers, but none had managed to capture her attention the way this woman did. The little girl's laughter echoed like music in the quiet bookstore, and it brought a faint smile to his otherwise serious face. When the reading was done, the girl hugged the book tightly. "Papa, can we buy this one? Please." He chuckled softly, nodding. "Of course." At the counter, as he paid for the books, he turned to the woman. "You have a gift with children," he said. She smiled, shaking her head. "Not really. I just enjoy spending time with them. They see the world in such simple, honest ways." He studied her for a moment, then asked, "Would you like to join us for lunch? My daughter insists." The girl, standing beside him, nodded eagerly. "Yes. Please come." The woman hesitated, but the child's hopeful eyes made it impossible to say no. "All right," she said softly. They walked to a nearby restaurant, one that had a cozy atmosphere and a small play area for kids. The little girl ran off to play for a while, leaving the two adults at the table. For the first time, they had a proper conversation. He told her a little about himself, how his wife had passed away years ago, how he had been raising his daughter alone, and how challenging it was to balance fatherhood with the demands of his work. He didn't go into too many details, but even the little he shared carried weight. She listened attentively, her heart softening with each word. She could see the strength it took for him to carry so much responsibility. And yet, beneath the strong exterior, there was a tired man who loved his daughter deeply. "You're doing a good job," she said quietly. He looked at her, almost taken aback. "I don't know about that. Some days I feel like I'm failing her. I can give her comfort, but I can't give her the presence of a mother." She didn't know how to respond at first. Then she said, "But you're giving her love, and that's more important than anything else. She feels safe with you. That matters." For a long moment, he didn't say anything. But his eyes softened, and he gave a small nod. Their conversation was interrupted when the little girl returned with a drawing she had made at the play corner. She had drawn 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright Sunday. "Look, Papa. Look," she said proudly. He smiled at the picture, then glanced at the woman. Strangely, the drawing looked like it included her too. The thought lingered in his mind, though he didn't say anything. Lunch ended with laughter and light conversation, most of it thanks to the child. When they stepped outside, the little girl once again clung to the woman's hand. "Can we meet again?" she asked eagerly. The woman bent down and brushed a strand of hair from the child's face. "Maybe we will. The city isn't as big as it seems." The girl grinned happily at the answer, and her father simply watched, quietly thoughtful once again. As they parted ways, the woman felt a strange warmth in her chest. She had met them by chance, yet something about the connection felt natural, as if their lives were meant to cross. She didn't fully understand it, but she didn't want to question it either. Meanwhile, as he drove home with his daughter, the man glanced in the rearview mirror. The little girl had fallen asleep in her seat, hugging the book she had chosen earlier. A small smile tugged at his lips. He thought about the woman, the stranger who had returned his most treasured possession, who had treated him with honesty, and who had managed to bring joy to his daughter without even trying. He didn't believe in coincidences, but this felt like more than chance. He didn't know what role she would play in their lives, but he had a feeling that this was only the beginning. And somewhere deep in her heart, she too felt that her world had shifted, though she couldn't quite explain why. A lost keychain had brought her to a man and his daughter, and now it seemed to be leading her into something larger, something she had never expected. The story of their lives, once separate, was slowly beginning to intertwine, one meeting at a time. The days that followed slowly began to shape into something new. What had started as a chance meeting kept turning into repeated encounters. Sometimes it was the little girl who insisted on visiting the bookstore, and sometimes it was the father who found himself nearby, almost as though drawn by a reason he couldn't admit even to himself. Each meeting carried a warmth that deepened with time. The little girl, once shy with strangers, now treated the woman like an old friend. She often held her hand, shared her drawings, or asked her to read her favorite stories. The bond was simple and pure, the kind that only a child could form. For the woman, these moments were like a gentle escape from her routine life. She had grown used to carrying responsibilities, balancing work and study, and keeping her dreams quiet. Yet, around the little girl and her father, she felt a different kind of peace. The laughter, the small conversations, and the warmth of companionship filled an empty corner of her heart she hadn't realized was there. But along with these gentle days came quiet challenges. One evening, after the bookstore closed, she found him waiting outside with his daughter. The child ran up to her excitedly, hugging her waist. "We came to walk you home," she said cheerfully. Surprised but touched, she smiled. "That's very sweet of you." As they walked together, the man spoke more than usual. He told her about his work, how the world expected him to be strong and flawless as a leader, but how behind that mask, he was just a father trying not to fail his child. "There are days," he admitted softly, "when I sit in my office surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. The only thing that keeps me going is her. She's my reason, my reminder of why I wake up each morning." She listened quietly, her heart heavy with unspoken empathy. She knew what loneliness felt like, though in different ways. And she understood that behind his sharp suit and calm expression was a man carrying pain he rarely showed to anyone. That night, when they reached her home, he paused before leaving. "You've given my daughter joy I haven't seen in years," he said. And you did it without asking for anything. I don't know how to thank you. She shook her head gently. I don't want thanks. Sometimes, kindness doesn't need a reason. Her words lingered in the air long after he left. As weeks turned into months, their bond deepened. Yet, with it came whispers of doubt in her own mind. She knew who he was: a successful man, someone who moved in circles she could never belong to. And she knew who she was: an ordinary woman struggling to make ends meet. The gap between their worlds was too wide. She often told herself she was only a friend to his daughter, nothing more. But fate doesn't always listen to reason. One afternoon, she was helping the little girl with a school project at their home. She had been invited over after the child's constant requests, and though hesitant at first, she couldn't refuse. The house was large, filled with the quiet elegance of wealth. Yet it didn't feel cold. Everywhere she looked, there were traces of the little girl drawings taped to the fridge, tiny shoes by the door, and stuffed animals on the couch. It was a home shaped by love, not just money. As they worked on the project together, the girl proudly showed her a framed photograph. It was of her parents, the man looking younger but still dignified, and beside him, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. That's Mama, the little girl said softly. She gave Papa the keychain. The woman felt her chest tighten. Now the story behind the keychain was no longer just words, it was real, captured in that picture. She understood why he had reacted so strongly when she returned it. It wasn't just an object. It was a memory of the love he had lost, the family that had once been whole. That evening, when the girl fell asleep after hours of laughter and stories, she found herself sitting across from him in the living room. The air was quiet, filled with the soft hum of the night. He poured himself a glass of water and looked at her with a kind of openness she hadn't seen before. She looks at you differently, he said suddenly. With trust. With comfort. That's rare for her. She lowered her gaze. Maybe she just needs someone to listen to her. He shook his head. It's more than that. She feels safe with you. And so do I. The last word slipped out almost unconsciously, but they hung heavy in the air. She looked at him, caught in the intensity of his gaze. There was no pretension in his eyes, no arrogance of a man used to power. Instead, there was honesty, raw and unguarded. Her heart raced, but she quickly looked away. You shouldn't say things like that, she whispered. We're from different worlds. I can't give you what you deserve. His expression softened, but his voice was steady. What I deserve doesn't matter. What matters is what feels right. Before she could respond, the sound of the little girl stirring in her sleep broke the moment. They both looked toward her, and the silence returned, thick with unspoken feelings. The following days were filled with confusion for her. She kept telling herself she was only a friend to his daughter, yet her heart betrayed her each time she remembered his words. And though he never repeated them, his actions spoke silently, waiting for her after work, bringing small things she mentioned in passing, and listening to her as though her words truly mattered. But not everything was smooth. People around him began to notice her presence. Colleagues, business partners, and even distant relatives whispered about the woman who seemed to be appearing in his life. Some saw her as a distraction, some as an outsider who didn't belong. She felt the weight of those stares whenever she was near his world. It reminded her of the distance between them, of the fragile line she was afraid to cross. She began to question whether staying close was right for him, for his daughter, and for herself. One evening, as she walked home alone, she thought deeply about it. The bond she shared with the little girl was precious, and the connection with him was undeniable. But love, she reminded herself, wasn't always enough to fight against the walls society built around people. And yet, no matter how much she tried to step back, her heart resisted. She remembered the first day she found the keychain, the small decision to pick it up, to return it without expecting anything. That choice had brought her here, to a place where her life had become entangled with theirs. She wondered if it was destiny. Or if it was simply the kindness of one moment leading to another, like ripples spreading across water. Whatever it was, she knew she stood at a turning point. And the next choice she made would decide not just her future, but theirs as well. The days grew heavier with unspoken feelings. She tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, telling herself she was only a friend to his daughter. But deep inside, she knew her heart was no longer hers alone. It belonged partly to the little girl who trusted her so purely, and partly to the man whose quiet eyes carried both strength and loneliness. He, too, seemed caught in a silent struggle. He never forced words on her, never tried to make her admit anything, but his presence grew stronger in her life. He appeared outside the bookstore when she finished work, he asked about her studies, and he remembered every small detail she mentioned. He was a man used to controlling empires, but when it came to her, he was patient, almost hesitant, as though afraid of breaking something fragile. The little girl, on the other hand, was never hesitant. She would run into the woman's arms, cling to her hand, and chatter endlessly about school and dreams. One day, she declared boldly, "I wish you could live with us. Then I wouldn't feel lonely when Papa is busy." The woman froze, her heart twisting at the innocent request. She glanced at him, and their eyes met briefly. There was longing in his gaze, but also restraint. He didn't say anything, and she gently told the child, "Some wishes take time." That night, lying in bed, she thought about the girl's words. Was she foolish for even being part of their lives? Was she giving the child hope that might later turn into pain? The questions kept her awake, circling in her mind until dawn. The challenge became harder when whispers began to grow louder. She had noticed the sharp stares when she accompanied them in public, the way people judged silently, as if asking why a man of his stature was seen with a woman like her. It hurt, not because she cared about their opinions, but because she feared it might affect him and his daughter. One evening, she made up her mind to distance herself. She told herself it was better to step away now than to cause trouble later. When he came to walk her home, she stopped at the bookstore door and said softly, "You shouldn't keep coming here. People are starting to talk." He looked at her steadily. "And does that matter to you?" "It should matter to you," she whispered. "You have a name, a company, a daughter. I don't want to be the reason anyone questions you." His expression darkened with frustration. "Do you think I care what people say? I've built everything I have by making my own choices, not theirs. And this," he paused, his voice softer now, "this is my choice too." Her heart trembled at his words, but she shook her head. "Your world and mine are too different. I can't fit into it. And I don't want your kindness to turn into regret later." He didn't argue further. Instead, he stepped back, his jaw tight, his eyes holding a storm of emotions he didn't release. "If that's what you believe," he said quietly, "then I won't force you." That night, she cried silently, though she couldn't explain why. Days passed in silence. She threw herself into work, avoiding places where she might see them. The absence of the little girl's laughter weighed on her, but she convinced herself it was for the best. Yet her heart ached every time she walked past the cafe or the park, memories of their moments together replaying in her mind. Meanwhile, he tried to continue life as usual, but his daughter noticed the change. "Papa, why doesn't she come anymore?" the girl asked one night, her eyes filled with confusion. He sighed deeply, pulling her close. "Sometimes, people step away even if they care. It doesn't mean they don't think of us." The child shook her head stubbornly. "But I miss her. She makes me happy." "You miss her too, don't you?" His silence was answer enough. One Saturday morning, as she was shelving books, she heard a familiar giggle behind her. She turned quickly, and there stood the little girl, her arms wide open. I found you, the child exclaimed, running into her arms. Tears welled in her eyes as she hugged the girl tightly. I missed you too, she whispered. The man was there as well, standing a few steps away. He didn't say anything at first, only watched the reunion quietly. When their eyes met, she saw the same storm, but this time it was mixed with something softer hope. Later, they sat at a quiet corner in the bookstore. He finally spoke. I know why you stepped away. But avoiding us won't protect us. It will only hurt her and us. She lowered her gaze, her hands trembling slightly. I don't want to bring more challenges into your life. He leaned forward, his voice firm yet gentle. Challenges are a part of life. But not everyone brings light into my daughter's world. You do. And that's not something I can ignore. The little girl, sensing the weight of the moment, suddenly said, I want us to be a family. Is that so hard? Her innocent voice broke the silence. Both adults looked at her, their hearts tightening. Children often spoke the truth adults were too afraid to admit. The woman's eyes filled with tears. She had tried to resist, to fight against the differences, but in that moment, she realized love was not about matching worlds. It was about hearts choosing each other despite the odds. She reached out and held the child's hand. I don't know what the future holds, she said softly, but I promise I'll always care for you. The girl smiled brightly, leaning against her. The man's expression softened too, relief washing over his features. He didn't press her for promises she wasn't ready to make, but he knew the wall she had built around her heart was beginning to fall. In the weeks that followed, things slowly shifted. They spent more time together not as strangers caught by chance, but as people building something real. There were still whispers, still doubts from outsiders, but they learned to ignore them. The little girl's laughter became the bridge that brought them closer, and soon the warmth between them became undeniable. One evening, as the three of them walked home after dinner, the man stopped under the glow of the streetlights. He took out the silver keychain, the one that had started it all. Holding it gently, he said, this was once a reminder of my past. But now, it's also a reminder of how you came into our lives. She looked at him, her heart heavy with emotion. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, he continued, but I know this: I don't want to face it without you by our side. The little girl, standing between them, held both their hands tightly, her face glowing with joy. For the first time, the woman allowed herself to smile without fear. Perhaps love didn't need perfect timing or matching worlds. Perhaps it only needed courage, kindness, and trust. What began with a lost keychain had turned into something far greater: a chance for healing, for love, and for a new beginning neither of them had expected. And as they stood together that night, under the quiet sky, it was clear that their story was only just beginning.